So originally I had planned this month's video to be an Omega Ranger takedown, but unfortunately these comics they have so much Omega Ranger stuff in them, so it's taking a bit longer than expected to finish. So to keep my one video per month goal and line up with the Halloween season just for fun, we're gonna condense the topic a little bit to one specific Omega Ranger, Spark, I'm just gonna say Spark, the Omega Gold Ranger, or as they're most well known as, the Death Ranger. Death Ranger is notable, I think, in that they are one of the few more modern comic concepts to really take off with the general public. I remember their official debut cover sparking a few viral social media posts that you never saw with characters like, I don't know, Candace or Archon or Yale, no matter how much Boom really tried to push Yale. And I think this is for a few notable reasons. A, while you can make fun of it for being too edgy, I saw a few Batman Who Laughs comparisons, their design is striking, and the overall concept of basically a Power Ranger Grim Reaper is something that's so over the top, it wraps around to being awesome. And B, while they weren't the first non-binary Ranger or even the first non-binary Ranger character, Ori the Squadron Blue Ranger in Power Rangers universe was the first non-binary Ranger, and the first non-binary character overall was the Omega's robot helper G. I guess retroactively, the Blue Emissary was the first non-binary character, as they are Ori, but that was retconned in later, and thus Blue was only referred to as he, him in their entire... Anyway... They were probably the first to be advertised as being non-binary, and in general, them being non-binary lended itself to a lot of jokes about how they weren't a boy or a girl, but instead death itself. And yes, they're not just non-binary because they're a ghost, so they don't have gender or whatever. They were referred to as they, them long before they died. I do think there's criticism to be made about how Boom's non-binary characters typically end up being aliens or robots in this series, but regardless, Spark was always non-binary. Instances where they're referred to as he, him are very wrong and very transphobic. So with these factors, their inclusion in the story was something that got super hyped up, and to this day, they're still one of the comic characters to most frequently get used for merch in games and stuff, only behind Draken and Ranger Slayer, which is pretty impressive considering they're an all-original character versus how Draken and Ranger Slayer are alternate versions of canon characters, which probably makes it a little surprising that you don't see much discussion about their actual stories in the comic. Something I think is because their presence in the comics is, underwhelming for as much promise as their character had. And this comes from a few factors. They ended up being very safe with the concept of a ranger with the power of death, and ultimately different authors had different ideas as to what to do with them, ending with the character feeling very inconsistent as a result. Like, they never really settled on who or what they were supposed to be. So, to start off, Death Ranger debuts during the end of the Mighty Morphin / Power Rangers era, where the main book, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, basically split in two, with the Mighty Morphin side focusing on the MMPRs, while the Power Rangers side focused on the Omega Rangers, made up of Jason, Zach, and Trini as the comics take on the Peace Conference split. Andros, yes, in space Andros, he's here too, has been looking for the Gold Omega Morpher, a legendary artifact with the power to raise the dead, and joins up with the Omegas in order to get into their vault and get his hands on it. When he does, he puts it on a comatose Zane, who is immediately used as a host body by the Death Ranger rather than truly bringing him back to life, though Death Ranger pretty quickly drops him in favor of killing Jason and using him as a host instead. The Death Ranger goes on to kill Zach, Trini, and the current Blue Omega Ranger Yale and adds them to their zombie army along with Zane. Andros realizes he kinda messed up in trying to team up with the evil zombie monster and goes to the MMPRs for help. Their fight and the defeat of the Death Ranger ultimately being the main plot of MMPR's 100th issue. While for the most part they deliver on the basic concept of Power Ranger with the ability to make zombies, some key points to note about their personality are that A, they say they want to fight evil and give justice to those who have fallen, starting out by destroying a space station of aliens that were laying siege to Andros' home of KO-35, and specifically naming Dark Spectre as an evil they want to destroy, and B, they point out to the Omegas as they fight them that their actions throughout the series have caused harm to those across the galaxy. Examples being like the emissaries dying, which led to the Imperials rising and destroying entire planets, and the Omegas freeing Lord Draken and letting him loose to fulfill whatever plans he might have. They also note that the modern Omegas bring dishonor to the name of Omega Rangers in general. Ultimately, this all serves to unfortunately put them in the same specific box of villainy that Kia, Jason Zaccantrini's first Blue Omega, ended up in. That they rightfully point out all the ways Jason Zacchantrini screwed up and hurt people, but because they're the evil ones, we're not supposed to listen or even believe the Omegas are in the wrong at any point. But these are still interesting points to keep in mind as we get into the following Death Ranger stories. After the 100th issue, the storyline continues into the Recharged Era, aka Darkest Hour, aka the finale of the series as a whole. Both teams mention still recovering from what happened with Death Ranger, and they ultimately get revived by Rita Repulsa, now Mistress Vile, into their Omega Gold body to serve in her army for Dark Spectre. They capture Cole, Max, and Alyssa of the Wild Force Rangers during Mistress Vile's attack on the timeline, but their zombie powers get overpowered by Dark Spectre's infection in a show of strength. And when they go to Earth to get more bodies, Dark Spectre punishes them to make it clear that he's abusive, and Rita lands the final blow by supposedly disintegrating them. However, the final issue reveals that she actually hid them in the Zeo Crystal and are brought back, presumably by Zed, to fight against Dark Spectre in the final battle. The last time we see them is when Dark Spectre, breaks their neck or something, and they die laughing? Also, they might have drawn out Vessel's spirit. It's honestly very unclear, but it fits into the no one got a satisfying conclusion theme of Darkest Hour. So, right off the bat, we see a very weird divide between their characterization in Charged to 100 versus Darkest Hour. Spark went from wanting to destroy evil, specifically Dark Spectre, to swearing complete loyalty to Dark Spectre's evil army. There's a mention that they serve Mistress Vile out of gratitude for her giving them their body back, but them groveling to Dark Spectre later seems completely out of character after Charged to 100 made it clear that their motivation was to destroy evil no matter the cost. Their whole reason for taking over the Omega was because they thought they did a bad job of being heroes, and as stated, brought dishonor to the name of Omegas by letting these terrible things happen. And yes, they turn on the villains at the end, but not through their twisted morality of wanting to stop evil the wrong way, just that Dark Spectre and Mistress Vile threw them out and they wanted revenge. The Death Ranger of Charged to 100 and Death Ranger of Darkest Hour essentially feel like completely different characters. Even something similar to Alpha 1's arc in the event, where they felt gratitude and loyalty to Rita but eventually planned to usurp Dark Spectre until they were caught and destroyed, would have felt slightly more connected to their Charged to 100 characterization than them pitifully begging for mercy and insisting on their loyalty as Dark Spectre is physically beating them. So this is just the main series. Things get even more disjointed when you read their origin story. We see their origins as an entry in the side book series Power Rangers Unlimited, The Death Ranger, where we learn that they were the sixth of the original Omega Rangers a millennia ago. Their species operated on a thing called the Legacy, where basically instead of dying, their species mind joins a collective consciousness sort of thing. And as such, they have no concept of death as we know it. When their friend Haza, the Blue Ranger, it's always the Blue Rangers for some reason, is killed in a monster attack, they have a complete breakdown over experiencing grief for the first time, and make a deal with a monster called the Galactic Maw to learn how to reverse death through the power of their morpher. They eventually gain the power of reanimating zombies through powering them with the morphing grid, but before they can do anything with it, they are killed and their essence gets sealed inside their morpher as it can't find the collective consciousness thing of their home people. It's a little confusing, but I do have to admit I like how Spark is probably the most alien out of the original aliens Boom has introduced in their comics. Anyway, the Omegas seal their morpher away and it sits in their little monster collection vault until Jason Zaccantrini's time and Andros finds it, circling back to the events of Power Rangers. The Unlimited books in general were kind of a mixed bag in my opinion. They were clearly made with the purpose of filling in the gaps between characters and story arcs in the main series, but sometimes it felt like they weren't properly connected or taken into consideration as much as they could have, with a lot of elements that the Unlimited books would introduce never being elaborated on or brought up in the main series. In Death Ranger's case, the main series references the general backstory of them being one of the original Omegas, sealed away after gaining the power to conquer death and wanting justice for those grieving, but the specifics of their past, like them turning into the Death Ranger out of grief for their friend Haza, isn't brought up for pathos, and G being their robot buddy at the time isn't mentioned by either. This is taken even further in Darkest Hour. While that arc confirms that the Galactic Maw that taught them how to revive death was in fact Dark Spectre the whole time, something that was kind of hinted at with the font design being the same and Maw's design of gaping teeth looking similar to Dark Spectre's, but that really makes no sense with Spark originally wanting to defeat Dark Spectre, implying that they know the two are separate entities, and it not really lining up with what Dark Spectre is or how he operates. Boom is pretty inconsistent with Dark Specter's powers, but the Unlimited book talks about how the Maw has like a portal into the next world through their mouth, which is not at all Dark Specter, and he shouldn't have been fighting the original Omegas anyway, since his whole thing is he can't enter our world without a body. What would Dark Specter gain from such a power as Sparks, especially considering in Darkest Hour itself, he punishes Death Ranger for doing the thing he gave them power to do? It's one of the things that makes Dark Specter in Darkest Hour such an ineffective villain. Why wouldn't Dark Specter want Death Ranger out there making as many zombies as they can for Dark Specter to add to his army? Especially considering Death Ranger was nothing but loyal to him at the time. The intention is obviously to give them depth, but when that added information doesn't influence anything in the main story, then it just feels like wasting time and wasting potential for taking the main series beyond just Spark being the scary new villain that the Rangers have to destroy and not have any reflection over their points that they've done more harm than good during their career as Omegas. And I'm not saying Spark should have been redeemed or anything. There is some fun to an edgy death villain for edge's sake. Though, like I'll get into with Kia one day, it's a little frustrating that these nuanced villains have to keep getting written as more and more one-dimensional to make them irredeemable with every new appearance they make. When world-conquering murderers Zed and Rita can talk about redemption all day just because they turned good in the show. But Spark wasn't just edge for edge's sake. The comics had the potential for a character that had more to them in their story than just their zombie gimmick. There was tragedy in them simply not understanding death because of their species' development, and because their teammates didn't take their feelings into consideration enough, that grief was taken advantage of by a higher power that twisted them to their liking. And ultimately, they get no closure or even an attempt at an arc where they could finally accept what had happened. They're just the evil boogeyman that Jason defeats by punching really hard, and then turned into a whimpering heel that ultimately doesn't do anything until they get zapped away and forgotten about, just to randomly come back at the very end to do more nothing. Have I mentioned before that Darkest Hour introduced a really intriguing plot thread of Death Ranger specifically wanting to possess Kim because her broken heart over losing Tommy made her an easy potential host, so that gets dropped the issue it's introduced? Because that would have been really cool and a really interesting potential arc that we could have done with connecting Spark and Kim's grief, but I guess we had to focus on Matt and Hyperforce instead. Okay. Sorry. Not going to rant about Darkest Hour again. Go see my review of Darkest Hour if you want to hear me complain about all that stuff. I think a lot of this feeling of not taking Death Ranger to their full potential also has to do with the comics essentially creating an unbeatable character, and thus they have to keep nerfing them in order to make it believable that they can be lesser to Dark Specter, the villain that Boom had been building up to for years at this point. This is shown as early as MMPR 100. We see Jason die, like he gets impaled on screen, and Yale, Zack, and Trini are heavily implied to also get murdered, only off screen. Zack in particular is implied to have gotten mauled to death when a zombie Yale jumps on him. But when Death Ranger is defeated, to contrast the other bodies they control dying again, or in Zane's case, going back into his coma, the Omegas just seem to recover without taking into account that they, died. And obviously this is due to plot armor more than anything. Jason, Zack, and Trini can't permanently die, of course, but it sets a precedent that Death Ranger can't have any lasting impact on the story in a way that matters to them. I think this is partly why people assume the 100 storyline would end with Yale dead at the very least, as the comic OCs are more expendable. This comes to a head in Darkest Hour, where we have to believe that they can be cowed by Dark Specter. Which, I'm sorry guys, I know you tried super hard to prove your version of Dark Specter isn't a joke like he was on the show, but even if you made him some Unicron-esque all-powerful demon, he's still not on the level of death itself. But apparently he is, because Dark Specter literally takes Death Ranger's zombified Wild Force Rangers and puts them under his own spell because it's just that easy for him to reverse. Again, why didn't they just keel over once they were freed from the spell? I thought Death Ranger had to kill people to control them. And yes, power levels are nonsense, and he was boosted by Rita, whatever, blah, 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 blah. But there's a reason why most stories present death as the force above everything, because that's what death is. Even the Unlimited book implied that Dark Specter was only able to help Spark gain these death powers in the first place because their morpher, inexplicably had the power within it. How and why is never addressed, but there seemed to be some implication that since they originally had sun powers, as the sun gives life, it would have the capacity for power over death, like as its inverse or something. I don't know, it's just a theory. And while Spark technically isn't death itself like other media tends to interpret, They are basically addressed as such. Zordon literally calls them Death Incarnate, so I think it's safe to say you're supposed to consider them Death personified. But that hype doesn't translate to what we get in the story, both in the power and their overall narrative and presence as a character. I genuinely think they should have just been the main villain of Darkest Hour as like their second wind after Charge to 100 rather than Dark Spectre. It would have been repetitive having the same villain again, but the storyline was already dealing with a ranger infection to the point where we got a line of zombie ranger themed covers despite Dark Spectre not making zombies like that, so it still would have fit. But in the end, what Death Ranger amounts to is ultimately superficial cool for coolness sake. On the surface, a fun zombie ranger concept that we can put on covers and turn into statues to appeal to horror fans, but in the story itself, just a generic evil force that ends the series as a Goldar level lackey despite having, like, 1,000 times the power and ability of anyone else here. They don't really impact any of the stories they're a part of. The closest they get to having an impact here is when Jason loses his Omega powers because Andros has to sever his connection to the grid to free him from Death Ranger's hold and thus leaves the team, which really doesn't feel like much now in hindsight of Darkest Hour, almost immediately putting him back in the spotlight in the same position of leader, just with the civilian army rather than the Power Rangers. And even then, he still acts like a leader to the Rangers who talk to him, so if some rando came up to me and asked me what cool things Death Ranger did, I'd be like, they're non-binary, that's cool. I hate what the books did to Kia, and don't worry, we'll get to Kia. But I can at least talk about who she is and what she did for the story, and dynamics with other characters like her hatred for Draken and her toxic eerie with Trini. Spark just has nothing. What they did have would be brought up once but amount to nothing, and they had no real dynamics with other characters after their debut. They get nothing in particular with the Omegas, particularly Jason, despite having possessed him, or G, despite G being part of their original group. Their past with their original team, and particularly their friendship with Haza, never comes up. Their newfound loyalty to Mistress Vile and Dark Spectre is unexplained and unexplored beyond just getting a body out of it. The really intriguing moment with Kim gets abandoned and never brought up again. They just have nothing to them beyond their powers and design. And it's such a shame for a character that had so much hype and so much potential to live up to that hype. Also, they had a really cool axe thing as a weapon, and it's really, really lame that we literally never get to see it in the comics. Like, ever. I still can't believe their origin story didn't end with them killing all the original Omegas. They're super lame anyway. No one would have cared, I promise you.